Does the Bible say that human sacrifice is okay? Leviticus, as well as many other books in the Bible, say no, it is not. However, some people claim that Judges chapter 11 says that it is okay. How could the Bible possibly contradict itself on this issue? Well, let's take a deep look into the scriptures involved and try to understand what's going on here. The first thing we need to understand about human sacrifice in the Bible is that God sees it as very, very evil. And the Bible makes this so clear, like unbelievably clear. I'm going to give three examples, but there are many verses in the Bible where God makes it very clear that the Israelite people are not to offer human or child sacrifices at all. Leviticus 18:21 says, "You shall not give any of your children to offer them to Moloch, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord." Now, anytime you see Moloch mentioned here, you can assume that it means child sacrifice. We're pretty sure that he was a pagan god. Either way, for sure, his name is involved always with child sacrifice. So when Leviticus 18 says, "You shall not offer your children as a sacrifice to Moloch," it's saying you shall not offer them as a sacrifice. God takes human sacrifice so seriously that he even says in Leviticus chapter 20 that the death penalty is to be applied to anyone who offers their children as sacrifices. God sees this as an evil thing that is worthy of death to the Israelites if they do this to their children. And lastly, Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 31 says this: "You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way, for every abominable thing that the Lord hates they have done for their gods, for they even burn their sons and their daughters in the fire for their gods." So, as an example of how extreme and evil the people around Israel are, the example is brought that they offer their children as sacrifices. So, these are just three of several verses that make it clear God does not condone human sacrifice. In fact, not only does he not condone it, he sees it as very evil, as an abomination. So then you might be wondering, how in the world could there be a contradiction here if God is so clear about his view of human sacrifice? Well, skeptics would say that in the book of Judges, chapter 11, there is a story here that somehow proves that God is okay with human sacrifice. While the story we're about to read is difficult for sure, it in no way proves that God supports human sacrifice. This account revolves around a man named Jephthah, who is one of the judges of Israel. The judges were special leaders that God raised up to lead Israel during a certain period of its history. Jephthah was a very good military leader, and God used him to do incredible things. However, he was also a broken, sinful human, just like the rest of us, and we're going to see that in this story. Jephthah is preparing to go to battle with the rest of Israel against this people group called the Amorites. And as he is getting ready to do battle with these Amorites, he makes a vow before God, and he says this. And this is starting in Judges 11, verse 30. "And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord and said, 'If you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whatever comes out from the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering.'" Now, for those of you who are, thinking critically about this, you might already see where the problem is. And I don't know why Jephthah makes this vow. I legitimately don't know where his heart was at when he says this. But we're going to see how that was not a wise thing to vow at all. Okay, so he makes this vow: "Whatever comes out of my house when I return, if we're victorious, I will offer as a sacrifice to you." So then Israel goes to battle with the Ammonites. God does give them victory. And then Jephthah returns home. And this is where the story gets really unfortunate. Starting in verse 34, "Then Jephthah came to his home in Mizpah, and behold, his daughter came out to meet him with tambourines and with dances. She was his only child. Besides her, he had neither son nor daughter. And as soon as he saw her, he tore his clothes and said, 'Alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low, and you have become the cause of great trouble to me. For I have opened my mouth to the Lord, and I cannot take back my vow.'" So now here's the problem with the story. Jephthah made this vow that whatever comes out of my home, this I will offer to you. And the first thing to come out of his home is his daughter. Jephthah tells his daughter this vow that he made. And amazingly, she actually tells him that if this is what he vowed to the Lord, that he should go through with it and do this, which is an incredible thing for her to say. Jephthah gives her time to mourn for her life. And then we read in verse 39, "At the end of 2 months, she returned to her father, who did with her according to his vow that he had made," which the story would seem to say means that he offered her as a burnt sacrifice to God. Now, a quick note on this story: there is some disagreement with scholars about whether or not Jephthah actually sacrificed his daughter to God, or Maybe he offered her as a servant to the temple. So she just served God the rest of her life. There are some clues in this passage that could lead us to believe this. However, the traditional view that's been held by the early church fathers and many scholars is that he actually sacrificed her as a burnt offering to God, as a human sacrifice. Now, there's no doubt this story is hard to hear and is a difficult story. But how does this prove that God approves of this human sacrifice that Jephthah made? Remember, the Bible has made it very clear that God does not approve of human or child sacrifice. So, where in this passage do we read that God does approve of this sacrifice? The short answer is nowhere. Nowhere in this story is God at all saying that Jephthah's vow was a good thing. Skeptics will make the argument and say that because God gave Israel victory, he was somehow approving of Jephthah's vow. But it was in spite of Jephthah's vow that Israel got victory, not because of it. Remember, God has no obligation to change his goodwill just because we make a vow. For instance, I could vow to God and say, God, I will rob a bank if I don't get a raise at work. Is God now obligated to give me a raise at work because I vowed to do something sinful if he doesn't? Of course not. Our vows cannot control God. If they could, then he wouldn't be God anymore and we would be able to control him. Reading through Judges 11, nowhere in the chapter does God ever agree with Jephthah's decision or even acknowledge it. We have no reason to believe that God gave the Israelite people victory because of Jephthah's vow. Rather, I would argue it's in spite of the fact that Jephthah made that foolish vow. Remember, God has made it very clear that he does not agree with human sacrifice. The other thing to note about Jephthah's story is that while he made this vow to God, and it's certainly a bad thing to break your vow, there's nothing to say that he couldn't have repented to the Lord and said, I made a mistake. I should not have vowed to do this. I will offer something else to you instead. But instead of doing that, Jephthah goes through with his vow, even though God has made it very clear he does not want human sacrifices. When it comes to human sacrifice, the Bible is clear and consistent with God's view of human sacrifice, and that is that it is evil and an abomination. While Jephthah's story is unfortunate, it has way more to do with a foolish, misguided vow than God at all approving of the sacrifice. Nowhere in the chapter does God ever acknowledge or say that this vow is the reason that he gives victory to Israel. Rather, we can very reasonably assume that God is giving victory to Israel in spite of Jephthah's vow, not because of it. Because this passage gives us no reason to believe God's view on human sacrifice has changed, there's no contradiction here. The Bible's view is still consistent. I hope this video was helpful for you today. Thank you for watching. God bless, and I'll see you in the next video.